It's that time of the week again when we review all of the ways in which the media covers themselves in glory. Joining us now to do exactly that is Katie Halper. She is host of the Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. Always great to see you, Katie.
Good to see you, Katie.
Thanks, you guys too.
So, really crazy story this week, which is Nathan Robinson. He's the editor of the Current Affairs magazine. Let's put this up there on the screen. He says that he was fired for a series of satirical tweets about U.S. military aid to Israel. So here's the actual tweets themselves. Did you know that the U.S. Congress is not actually permitted to authorize any new spending unless a portion of it is directed towards buying weapons for Israel? It's the law. Or, if not actually the written law, so ingrained in political custom as to be functionally disputable by the law. So what happened is that a Guardian editor, who he often writes columns for, reached out to him and said no such law exists in reference to the joke about a legal mandate. He said, in which case, this is what you might once say is fake news irrespective of the later tweet, and informed him that they wouldn't be writing for them anymore. So this is just a clear, pretty example of absolute BS, like in terms of a firing, or not even a firing, or no longer continuation of a relationship for a very clear joke, which was politically sensitive, maybe to them.
It's really mild, honestly.
It's not even that bad.
Sorry, I'll let you.
No, go ahead. I'm just teeing it up for you. I'm going to give us the facts. Guardian says he wasn't fired. They're like, look, he's at will, etc. Go ahead.
That's right. Yeah, sure. It's like we live in a world where we can fire people all the time, so it's actually not firing. Okay, yeah, He didn't have a built-in contract, I guess, about every. But he was a columnist for them. He was a regular columnist for them, and now he's no longer that. So that's firing, I think, in any real sense of the term. But yeah, it's interesting because to me the email that the editor sent to him, whose last name is Mahalan or Mullaney, so I would just like to say, as a member of the tribe, you're not helping us, sir. It's not a good luck for us Jews for people to get fired for saying things that people deem anti-Semitic just because they're critical of Israel. And I'd like to remind the world that some of the best and biggest critics of Israel are Jews. Okay? So Noam Chomsky would disagree with you. Norman Finkelstein would disagree with you, Guardian, for firing Nathan. And actually equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is extremely anti-Semitic in itself.
Yes.
I was kind of joking about the trope of Jews running the media and you can't criticize Israel. But that aside, it actually is a very established trope to equate Jewish identity with an unquestioning support for Israel. And again, we can get into it another time. It's a deeper discussion. But for lots of Jews, their Jewish identity, part of their Jewish identity, especially if they believe in something called tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. It's kind of a social justice part of Jewish culture, is speaking out against Israel's human rights offenses and abuses. But here's the deal. Regardless of what you think of Israel, you can't constantly, although people love doing this, say that it's anti-Semitic to point out the special relationship between Israel and the United States when so many United States politicians, from presidents to senators, constantly invoke said special relationship. And of course it's a special relationship. The only difference is, the U.S. has special relationships with lots of countries. I like to say that Israel is like the U.S.'s wife, and Saudi Arabia is like its side piece that it keeps under wraps, right? So, of course, there are different relationships. Some are public, some are private, some we're proud of, some we're not. But, look, the fact is, no matter what you think of politics and what you think of Israel, we had a very austere COVID relief bill, and at the same time we were giving lots of money to Israel, and that's basically the United States. That's kind of the U.S. government in a nutshell. And for Nathan to point this out, it's also the editor's being so. It's not fake news because no one with a brain believed that Nathan was saying that was an actual law, although it might as well be. But second of all, this is a fireable offense because you don't do this. You can't explain a joke. But he explained the joke, and when I say fireable offense, I'm joking. I'm talking comedically, not journalistically. The only thing Nathan did wrong was explain that the previous tweet was a joke, and I jest that there was nothing wrong with that. But I'm just saying, there was no gray area. It's not like you could even for a second argue Nathan was perpetuating a scary myth. He wasn't dropping some Protocols of Zion, and he wasn't saying anything that anyone with a brain would actually think was a law. So yeah, what was he doing? He was critiquing the U.S.'s unquestioning, problematic support of the Israeli government, despite its crimes against humanity. And there's really nothing wrong with doing that. And when you claim that that's anti-Semitic,
even if you disagree, even if you disagree, It's fine, but like you can't fire somebody for saying it. And here's the other thing: The Guardian has it's a left-wing newspaper. Last time I checked, they have criticism of Israel in there like all the time. So what is going on here?
Yeah, they did have Desmond Tutu. Someone pointed out recently. I think that they are pretty sensitive. There's this thing called PEP, Progressive Except for on Palestine. I don't know if you've heard that term.
No.
But it's a thing. It's a thing, and I'm sure you know.
I
people
learn something from you every day.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that because of the Jeremy Corbyn stuff, the Guardian is, and Nathan said this to me, I was talking to him the other day, that they're in some ways actually even more sensitive about this stuff than their U.S. office, because I think what happens is they've been really browbeaten. And I actually think because the British Jewish population isn't as big as it is in the United States, they don't have the spectrum of voices like me, or Noam Chomsky, not comparing myself to them, but Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein,
I understand.
Peter, Glenn Greenwald, right? They don't have those voices that push back on what is anti-Semitic or what isn't anti-Semitic. So I think it's even easier probably in England for them to have certain powerful, basically conservative, I would say, Brits who are Jewish pretending to speak for all Brits, for all Jews. And so this was basically, like we saw, they tried to do this with Bernie with anti-Semitism. It didn't work as well because he's Jewish. So they would call him like a self-loathing Jew, but they would call Corbyn an anti-Semite. So it's just really, it's toxic. And I honestly...
How did the Guardian position themselves during that smearing of Corbyn as anti-Semitic? I mean, were they on board with that? Did they push back against it? How did they position themselves?
I'd have to review all of their op-eds and all of their editorials, but I do know that they often had people accusing Corbyn of anti-Semitism. They were often publishing their pieces. So I would have to look at how it broke down, but that was definitely,
I just think, look, regardless, it's a legitimate view. It's obviously a joke. Getting fired or whatever for something like this is completely ridiculous.
Well, and this is Katie, one of the themes that you see. I despise the term cancel culture because of the way that it's been used and abused. But this is one of the common tactics of you take something that's a legitimate disagreement, then you label it as racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, etc., to say we can't even explore this thing, and that's how you justify the censorship, the firing, whatever the retribution ultimately is going to be. So this is totally classic pattern. Nathan asserts something in a satirical tweet that is a totally 100% legitimate and by the way, in my view, accurate critique of U.S. foreign policy. That gets tarred as anti-Semitic, and that justifies the severing of the relationship.
It does. What's interesting about this question is it's a bit more complicated because there is some pushback and some awareness that even within the framework of kind of woke culture or progressive or anti-racist culture, there's a tension here. And it should have always been there, but it was swept under the rug. But people realize more and more that basically declaring the humanity or recognizing the humanity of Palestinians, which is what I would argue comes out of criticizing Israel and what motivates criticizing Israel in large part. That's not something that the people who use the language of woke language, they're not justifiably, they're not willing to accept that as a premise. Now some are. Some people who are PEPs, right, progressives except on Palestine. And I would argue that a lot of people, like Hillary Clinton, for instance, people who weaponize the language of intersectionality, were very happy to do that, right? Palestine never figured into their analysis of the world. It was never part of their anti-racism view. And so I would say that, sorry, someone's calling me to give me
it's all good. Apparently we have to go too. So why don't you take that?
I get it.
It's been a great...
No,
that's
but
right.
Really quickly, I just want to say that this is interesting because it's not someone saying something. This, unlike other allegations, I think that oversimplify language, this really, it's harder to do this because built into the criticism of Israel is something which, in theory, people who care about intersectionality care about. In theory, and it's going to be, we'll see if they do this. We'll see if they actually talk about this because, again, Palestinians being human beings is something that should be embraced by people who would otherwise embrace cancel culture.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Katie.
Katie,
Appreciate
thank you for breaking it down. Great to see you. We'll have more Rising for you later today.